Welcome, TV Historians. We've got Annie Berke here with us to talk about the pioneer women writers of TV. And I love the early days of TV because there's just so little written about it and understood about what was going on. My immediate thought is Betty White. Now, my immediate thought is Annie Berke because she's done all the legwork to make these challenging years for these wonderfully talented women come to life so that we can better understand their challenges. Annie is an academic at heart because this book is actually a derivation of her doctoral dissertation, which she earned from Yale in the field of American Studies, Film, and Media, which makes her abundantly qualified to be the critic and culture writer that includes TV, movies, literature, comedy, all of it, in places like the Washington Post and the Village Voice and the Literary Hub. And you might see her most frequently as editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books. That's a pretty fine title. So we're going to welcome Annie to Advanced TV Herstory and start talking about TV women writers. Welcome, Annie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Cynthia. I had no plans to unseat Betty White from anywhere, but I really appreciate you having me on here to talk about my book.
Well, I'm glad you're here. And actually, some of the things that you wrote about tie into some of the other academic sort of writers who I've interviewed in the past. So for longtime advanced TV historians, this is actually, this is a very integrated curriculum that we've been working on for 8 years. So let's get going with you, Annie, by helping us understand what happened in your life that made you decide to dedicate at least a couple of years to these women who fascinated you.
They did. I mean, I could try to give a more sort of academic biography, but I'm going to start even earlier and say that if you Google me, Annie Berke, Berke, and you look at the way that I do my hair and the glasses I wear, I don't think it would be surprising to hear that when I was like 13, I wanted to be Tina Fey. I was watching her on Weekend Update and SNL. I thought I wanted to be a comedy writer. And I also wrote movie reviews for my high school newspaper. In college, I went on to sort of do internships in what's called film development, which means reading scripts, which is in my experience, was a much less creative pursuit than I had pictured reading scripts, considering how much you read it with sort of the market in mind. I don't know. In the meanwhile, I read all of these books and articles and exposés and puff pieces about the industry, and I kind of pivoted away from trying to work in the business, which requires a very thick skin and, from what I'm told, the ability to drive on Los Angeles highways. And I looked towards actually sort of being a critic and a historian of the industry. But I think that idea of like being a woman in the male-dominated field of comedy, of being like a woman power broker in a culture industry, just sort of stayed with me. And when I went to Yale for graduate school, I thought I was going to work on classical Hollywood performance, but I sort of found myself gravitating in a seminar about studio spaces towards women in the writer's room, being the only woman in a male-dominated space. Now, that's not something I know that much about, honestly. I went to a girls' school growing up, and I've always been attracted to subject matters, herstories that attract overwhelmingly, let's just say, non-cis male audiences, groups, communities. So I found it sort of like anthropologically interesting, and I got to study comedy in the process. And from there, it was a question of where do you go beyond this single case study? And it moved into women in the 50s, which was, an area that I think is way more complicated than many people know, in terms of that it was not this kind of overly conservative, extremely strict, rigid binary, but that there were a lot of interesting cultural and gender movements and expressions that I wanted to tap into by looking at what women were doing on screen, what they were doing behind the camera, and sort of how those two spaces informed each other.
It's my feelings, actually my understanding from studying Betty White, that in the 50s and even earlier, in the 40s, the budding medium of television really was wide open. It was an open field for women to come in and bring whatever experience they had from someplace else. And they were welcomed and recognized and poorly paid because there was no money in the field yet. And so I was intrigued when you set the time frame of your work of 1949 to 1963. Help us understand why you selected that 14-year time span.
Well, First of all, to gesture to your point of that this project began as a dissertation, usually dissertations do have some sort of historical time frame. For the purposes of sort of academic inquiry, we want to trace change over time, and you can't bite off more than you can chew. 1949 is not the beginning. It's not when television was invented. It took decades of scientific, technological development, but I would say that the device and the domestic product of the television, the industry behind it, really took off in the late 40s as people are starting to buy televisions. And, that feedback loop between making television and making sure that there are enough people to buy the televisions that would make it worth programming more. So I look at 1949 because I wanted to keep my eye on the 50s. And I think that there were a lot of shows that I look at more closely in this book. Your Show of Shows, which was originally titled The Admiral Broadway Review. The Goldbergs, which came from writer and performer Gertrude Berg, they start in 1949. So I wanted to start there. I felt like 1949 was this sort of the first year in which you see a lot of the shows that made their way into the 50s and that, for me, represent what was going on in that decade, started in 1949. 1963, I think that was even harder to pick. A starting point when you're thinking about the 50s is to start around the 50s. But where do you stop? I picked 1963 for two reasons. First, as a kind of nod to the second wave feminist thread of my argument, which is that these shows are anticipating the kind of conversations about women having it all, whether you can have a career and have a fulfilling personal life, that women might really not only need to work, but want to work. These are anticipating the kind of conversations that would become more commonplace and have more of a language to frame them in with the publication of The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, which came out in 1963. So like what she calls the problem that has no name, the kind of ennui and frustration that housewives might feel, then had a name. But what I want to talk about is how in these shows, before these terms came into parlance, women writers were obliquely writing about them or sort of responding to them just by being public figures. The other reason I wanted 1963 is it is the midpoint of the NBC sitcom The Dick Van Dyke Show, which ran from 1961 to 1966, which features a character named Sally Rogers, a woman TV writer inspired by real life women who are in the book, but that was written all by men. And so I kind of want to look at Sally Rogers as the culmination of the study, as a way of thinking about how the woman TV writer existed both as a real industry professional and as a kind of cultural type. And Sally Rogers, performed by the great Rosemary, is kind of, it's a happy and a sad ending, right? Because the woman writer is finally visible in a way that I think that many TV fans and buffs and historians would know her, but maybe wouldn't know the people that she was based on. So there is that kind of visibility. But the fact that she is not written by women, that she sort of overlaps with other maybe disappointing or backwards tropes about like how women can't have rewarding personal lives and successful professional lives, that she's kind of the stereotypical spinster with a cat on her lap, is just kind of like a disappointing conclusion for me for the study, to think about this is what Sally's become. She's become sort of a male authored product. To keep in mind that I actually love the Dick Van Dyke Show, but I really do. And I think that Rosemary brings a special kind of attention and energy and ambiguity to the part. But I do think in terms of thinking about how the study begins with women writing versions of themselves, writing about themselves, putting out versions of their personas that are complex and that maybe can bridge the gap between spinster and superwife and mom. I don't know. So that's why I wanted to end with 1963. My conclusion does look at Sally Rogers and Tina Fey. I can't get away from her.
These names do keep popping up. And it's really important. You can watch TV and we can all think about TV and whether it's That Girl or Mary Tyler Moore Show, whatever it is. And continuously, I find myself coming back to, okay, there are these milestones, as you just said, whether it's 1949 when finally the manufacturing of televisions brought the price down to a point where it was a family investment, but families were making that decision. 1963, The Feminine Mystique, and the midpoint of Dick Van Dyke, and what the importance of the representation of Rosemary was as Sally Rogers. And nobody has ever said to me, oh my gosh, I mean, I patterned my life off of Sally Rogers, just like nobody has ever said they patterned their life after Diane Chambers and Carla Tortelli from Cheers. These were male written and felt like a little bit of a one step back, even when we were watching them lifetime. But on the other hand, they were at least there. They weren't male characters, so there was something there. And I don't think too much about the Dick Van Dyke Show, and probably should. But you clearly think about it a lot.
I do. I do.
So talking a little bit about that very important series, which it was so innovative in so many ways, and it really put Mary Tyler Moore on the map, we will never know. I just don't think there will ever be a book written that really helps us understand the power that she wielded. Along with Grant Tinker, that's true, but there was a period of time where she had power in that circle. Why were there other women who were similarly talented and we don't hear their names? Tell us a little bit more about how these women have fallen off the map.
The women that we know from this period are overwhelmingly performers, like Lucille Ball, like Donna Reed. And I think that it's partially that they were performers and we can see them. But I just want to make a note that they also both had producer power. And as television went on, producer power became increasingly important. Having that kind of power allowed them more ability to determine their own careers, the trajectory of their shows, and sort of obliquely a kind of visibility, even though producing is behind the camera. It allows them to position themselves better than I think writers did, or writers without producer power. I feel like, to answer your question about like why don't we know them, there's sort of like the case study answer, the industry answer, and the cultural memory answer, if that makes sense. So first of all, the women in my book, I look at 5 body chapters and, oh gosh, even 6. So looking at these different women, there's always different reasons why they leave. Sometimes they choose to leave because they miss working on radio. They want to write alone. Sometimes the genres that they pioneered went out of fashion, like the example of Gertrude Berg and the Goldbergs. That was sort of a show that was developed from radio, and those kinds of talky, very sort of slice of life, lightly comic shows did not remain popular as the 50s went on. People were expecting something that was more visually dynamic, more about middle class as opposed to sort of working class audiences, that would allow the living room to be a kind of showcase. That's what networks and sponsors wanted. So sometimes the genres that they staked their names on were no longer in demand. In some cases, they passed away early. That's just the sad fact. That was also true of Gertrude Berg. She died in the 1960s before she may have had a chance to reinvent. Lucille Kalin is the example of the woman in the room who worked with Carl Reiner Mel Brooks on Your Show of Shows, which was a comedy variety show for Sid Caesar and Imogene Coca. Sid Caesar had a longer career as a performer.
If I can just interject for listeners who are thinking, I've heard of the name Imogene Coca. Probably one of the last things she did, which was very funny, was she was the grandma in Vacation, 1984, I think it was, Vacation. The grandma who passed away while they were all on vacation, and they put her in the rocking chair up on the roof of the van.
She just kind of like left television for a time,
right?
Because her husband died, and the show that she had after Your Show of Shows was a failure, and she sort of led a more private performing life than Sid Caesar.
I just have to believe there was not the kind of support structure to surround her and remind her just how hilarious she is. And even in reading your book, and we are remiss, listeners, the book's title is Their Own Best Creations. And then what's the rest of the title?
Women Writers in Postwar Television.
Yeah. So hilarious.
Coca had less of a budding career, but she, obviously, for people who knew to follow her, they did. Lucille Kalin went on to be a mystery writer. She didn't want to work in the writer's room anymore because it was awful. Writer's room was kind of awful. They yelled over her, allegedly wouldn't stop smoking cigars in the room even when she was pregnant. She said she wanted to write something and not always have it be a matter of committee. So people left for different reasons. I would say the overall trend for writers on the ground was that as television went from being based in New York, drawing on talent from radio and theater, and it moved to California, where it got absorbed into the Hollywood machinery. I always point to Joe in Sunset Boulevard, the kind of like, I'm trying to find a nice way to say it, sort of like the beaten down dead-eyed Hollywood hack writer, like that they enter that kind of space. Not that they all were like that, but just that idea that like moving from that where it's all entrepreneurial and like you mentioned that it's sort of this open field, it's more precarious, but it's more open, going into Hollywood where there is something that is very regimented and it is a lot about who you know. Not all women were able to make that jump, whether it was that they weren't able to make their way in or they lived on the East Coast and they didn't want to uproot their families. They wanted to stay where they were. So this is happening at the same time as producers grow in power and prestige. I have an anecdote in the book about how at Warner Brothers, they would take a script from like a Western show. The secretarial pool would change the names and the settings, and it would suddenly become a script for like a urban procedural detective show. Like they would use the same story, which I hate to say is like feels like a kind of precursor to these AI conversations that are happening right now with this strike. But this idea that the writers were being increasingly disempowered means that to the extent that women were writing, it's hard to even track down all those names or to give proper credit where it's due. And then the last one, I think, this last question of cultural memory, it's like, why don't we know about them? Is I think that there's a particular kind of attachment to the memory of the 1950s from one side of nostalgia, on the other side, a kind of general disapproval that the 50s was like the time when men were men and women were home vacuuming in high heels, and that anything that kind of throws a wrench into that binary maybe doesn't fit in the story that we have. And so those stories kind of fall away. There's this attachment to when we talk about the stereotypical white middle class woman in the 50s wearing pearls every day. That people say like very Donna Reed. And I think if there's one thing that this book maybe can help us interrogate, it's, Donna Reed was actually a producer on her show, a very powerful person in the industry. She hired blacklisted writers because she could. And I think that there is that kind of complexity and contradictory aspect to a lot of the women in this story. They were not activists, but they also, just by following their interests, following their bliss and living careers in the public, they were kind of pushing definitions of what it meant to be a woman in America at this point, particularly a specific kind of woman who maybe had finished high school, had gone to college, was white, was able to speak directly to the kinds of women at home that sponsors and networks wanted to reach for advertising and financial purposes. The kinds of women who got hired to write for television often were sort of models for the ideal viewer, consumer, citizen. As Anna McCarthy said, the citizen machine, right? 1950s television.
Having now done 8 years or so worth of episodes of Advanced TV Herstory, and really important ones were a fabulous 2-hour plus long conversation I had with Carol Stabile out in Eugene, Oregon, where we took apart her Red Channels, her Broadcast 41 book, and she talked a lot about the women whose careers never made it because the anti-communist fervor, it was all a ruse. Listeners, you really have to understand that it was just a bunch of lies. Men were feeling very vulnerable. They were realizing they were going to have to work harder. And this whole pack of women who had risen up through TV in particular, but also film, were scaring them. And they needed to do something to tamp them down and get them out of the room, get their show off the air, whatever it took. We were not going to have this kind of progress in the 50s. That was their intent. And so Red Channels as a publication and the amount of work that went out to the ad agencies and the sponsors was that this group of women, and there were a lot of women, were dirty, they were communist, they were subversive. It was all awful. So there is that aspect, which I just don't think we can talk about enough. I love Carol's work, and it's all founded on FBI files that she's taken a decade to pull together. Your book corresponds so interestingly with hers that we really start to see the picture of what was going on back there. But another piece of fascinating advice, which is very, it's like common sense. Sherry Lewis's daughter, Mallory Lewis, and I spoke. It's a video podcast from last fall. And she said, you always have to remember that it's the victors who write the history.
Right.
And so what we need to be mindful of is that these women who, as you just said, tried to typify and really directly appeal to who they understood their audience was, could not self-promote. They could not boast. they could very quietly encourage each other. The support network probably on the backside is so strong, we don't understand it today. But they were held into some strong limitations because if they stepped outside of the bounds of expectation, they would have been considered difficult to work with. And we lose them that way. So we were going to lose, we may never have seen it if they had written their own memoir, which none of them did, or very few of them. You can talk a little bit more just about having conversations with these women at a point where they were perhaps late in life. But we lost so much of it because up until now, history has not found the experience of the woman, particularly a woman in a rare situation like a writer's room, to be valuable enough to merit a book or anything. And then I'll just put in my last plug here. For Intimate Portraits, God bless Lee Grant and the Lifetime Network 30 years ago when they generated 150 episodes of Intimate Portraits and included perhaps some of the very women that episodes, they're very difficult to find. So it's not like we can go back and watch them. Sorry for that little rant. Every time these paths cross, it makes me say, yeah, I can keep doing this for another 8 years. Let's go.
Yeah. On top of all of this sort of cultural and ideological reasons why we forget these women, the constraints they were operating under that often forced them to perform a kind of modesty and anti-craft language for newspapers and magazines. Oh, I just listen to what people tell me. I base it on my lives in a way that you would never hear someone like Patty Chayefsky talk about his writing or any other well-known male writer. I just want to also put in like a sort of a material intervention, which is that a lot of television from the 1950s is lost. It is impossible to find because much of it was broadcast live and on a form called a kinescope, which is a very fragile kind of film strip and basically involved filming television off of a screen. So the quality is poor and the kinescope strip itself is fragile. So a lot of television you just can't watch anymore. There are many parallels between sort of that first decade of commercial television and early cinema. You're always working around absences. And that doesn't just mean that you can't watch an episode written by a woman, but you might not even know it exists because you might see a listing for it in the newspaper, but it won't list the writer on the listing. But if you actually had been able to watch it, you would see it. So there's all kinds of historiographic, the history of history, these problems of studying women's contributions when in fact it's hard to study really all writerly contributions to early television to know what was going on. And I think from what you get from these oral histories, from the Academy, Television Academy and places like that, there was that wide open Wild West feeling of early television, but they were not making television like they thought it was going to end up in a museum, which probably led to it being like kind of fun and you get like a school play vibe from a lot of early comedies and things. But it does make it harder, 70 years later, because there's a lot of absences that just can't be filled in.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more whether we were able to ever see some of these episodes, or in your case, you were able to find scripts that were written. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Sure, both.
How did these women do the craft differently than men?
I don't think necessarily that they wrote differently, but I think that their scripts, they hit different when they were written by women who also had a public persona. And I think sometimes to read their scripts and their personas together is what makes their work most compelling and most persuasive. Because I'm not ready to say that when I read a script, I can immediately tell who wrote it. Like this was clearly written by a woman or a man. I don't think I can go that far. But I can say that there were certain themes or preoccupations that women writers, when you read them next to what they would say about themselves, make for really compelling interpretations. So 2 women that I write about in, I think, chapter 3, Gertrude Berg, who I've mentioned, and Peg Lynch, who wrote Ethel and Albert, were both radio personalities who adapted their radio shows for television. They were both the writers, the creators, and the stars of their shows. And I think that both of them sort of talked about themselves as regular people, that like sort of no one else could play the part of a regular woman speaking in their voice but them. Peg Lynch would talk about Ethel. They auditioned other actresses, but they all had these beautiful Hollywood voices. And nobody had the kind of like nasal Midwestern twang that she had. So she was sort of compelled to play the part. But I think that when you look at Peg Lynch's script about playing dumb. Like, how do you play dumb to get your husband to do what you want, while at the same time reading them alongside interviews where she's like, oh, I'm no good at math. I'm not a business person. It's kind of fun to look at those together, to look at Gertrude Berg playing Molly Goldberg, who feels like she isn't keeping up with the Joneses in terms of her appearance, that she should be more glamorous, but she's not an MGM movie star. To sort of watch that, or to read that script in that case, alongside looking at sort of how Berg positions herself as a professional who isn't maybe as glamorous as Donna Reed and never claimed to be, is she's not only sort of articulating her place in the industry through the episode, but she's, to my mind, she's talking about what television is. You know, we have as many stars as in the night sky. This is like a television is by women, for women, regular, ordinary, unglamorous medium for the people watching at home to feel like that they're seeing a reflection of themselves. So I would say that I get these interpretations by looking at the press and the sort of extra textual materials into the scripts themselves.
Well, and certainly on the sponsorship and ad placement spectrum, you had the emerging housewife, whether it was soap or detergent or anything that made the household run easier. But then you also had the explosion of cosmetics and hairspray and everything. So it was to handle your work life and then also to make yourself look better than your neighbor. And so you might want to aspire to be more like Donna Reed, but it's okay because you had these common women too who you could relate to, who were more concerned about whether or not, their biscuits were fluffy or whatever the case might have been.
Right. Another example is on your show of shows with Lucy O'Kalin, the one who left to write mystery novels. She had a close writing partnership with the show's head writer, Mel Tolkien, and they together wrote a series of sketches called The Hickenloopers, which were played by the show's leads, Caesar and Coca. And that particular recurring sketch to me is such an epitome of what I'm talking about with these second wave feminist ideals. Like, this is a married couple that is also legible as a performing partnership between these two actors who are equally matched and funny, because not because one is subservient and the other one is in charge, but because they really share power both in the marriage and in the comedy. And that behind them, there's another kind of egalitarian writing partnership that she talks about, particularly later, like in the 90s, as she's reflecting on her career for the New York Times, a really egalitarian marriage and how that's coming through with the show and with sort of the behind the scenes and even the talk about what goes on behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. Before we get into sort of the last genre to talk about, and that is how then many of these women writers found that the suspense anthology dramas, which let's talk about that whole thing. But I'm really curious, how many of these women writers or their children were you able to hunt down and get, that true firsthand research or first level research?
Not many. The most sort of meaningful conversation I had was with Peg Lynch, who I just mentioned, of Ethel and Albert. I was in New Haven, and my friend and I drove to her home in Massachusetts to actually sit down with her. It was a total trip because she served the same lunch that Ethel would have served, watermelon pickles. And we watched some of the shows that I had not otherwise had an opportunity to see because she had them all on VHS. And I got to hear a little bit about her experiences on the set and the different people that she'd met, a lot of which did not make it into the book because they were either off the record or didn't fit into the argument I was making. Unfortunately, a lot of the people who I would have talked to had passed away by the time that I was writing. I also got a chance to talk to one of the suspense writer's daughters, who turned out to be a professor at a place where I would later teach for 3 years in Roanoke, Virginia, Hollins University. I got to hear from her about her parents, who together was Frances and Marion Cockrell. Their daughter's name is Amanda Cockrell. The two of them worked together on Alfred Hitchcock Presents, but you would probably know them best as a creative partnership because they worked on this 1960s Batman. That was sort of if you Google them, that's the first thing that comes up. But Marion was also a novelist. And that's one of the big shifts that I see in the book is you see these women in the early part of the 1950s. They're kind of like these proto showrunner homemakers, or in the case of Erna Phillips in soap opera, she's kind of like this anti-feminist, feminist media mogul, if you know what I mean. She wants to be sort of like a traditional woman, but also she can't be. And she is running several soap operas, but these are full-time plus occupations. Whereas in the latter part of the decade, when you see women like Marion Cockrell, writing for television is just like one of their gigs. They are also writing novels. They're doing other things because the kind of commitment that they get from shows is not necessarily enough to pay the bills. So they're doing multiple jobs, and when they are able, they're generating multiple streams of revenue from the same thing. They're adapting their own story from a magazine for a television show, and so they're going to like double dipping on their own intellectual property. But already you're seeing, even as early as the 1950s, you're seeing the increasing gigification and the sort of precarity of the television writer.
You were just referencing the suspense anthology dramas, which that just totally fell out of favor.
Yeah.
We lost it.
I think the one that we remember is like the Twilight. That's like the number one thing. And that barely even, I would say that's more like science fiction than suspense, but you could say it's a suspense anthology. And it's funny to think like that's the one that people would most know. And it has Rod Serling standing in front in his suit. It codes the show so masculine from the start. I mean, I love Rod Serling, but this like man in the black suit kind of introducing the Twilight Zone that you wouldn't know how much these suspense shows, Twilight Zone's a little bit late, but shows like Climax and Alfred Hitchcock Presents, how much they were looking for a female audience, how much they expected and predicted a female viewership for these kinds of shows, and how many women wrote for them.
Was it more friendly for women? Is that what made them attracted to it?
I would say for all writers, that kind of low commitment writing is probably less favorable to them than a staff position. But for people who wanted to continue to do other work, to write novels, continue to write plays, and at the same time, this would be a way to pick up extra money, that might be desirable. But I would say that would be probably true for both men and women. That kind of like, it depends on where television fits into your professional trajectory. Do you want it to be your full-time job or not? Television was a good place for women suspense writers who already were suspense writers. This was like another avenue for making money and making your name. So women like Charlotte Armstrong, like Marion Cockrell, they were coming not necessarily from like a radio background as some of the other women were earlier in the decade, or a theater background. They were coming from sort of a suspense, a genre background. And so that made it possible for them to make this transition.
So many talented women. The stories you relay in your book about what life was like in some of those writers' rooms is just, It makes you feel for them. I found myself admiring their tenacity and their desire to just come to work and give their best. And that's not enough. You have to put up with a frat boy environment. And it's just so disappointing. And the losses, and Carol and I talked about this when we were talking about the Broadcast 41. Had these women been allowed to have an impact on TV the way that they wanted to, and to be able to speak to women and male viewers and produce, but to tell stories and to highlight wonderful things, that never happened. And that changed culture by preventing that. Culture was then driven to something that was still very much shaped and manipulated by powerful white men to make money.
Right.
Oh, I hate to end this, this particular conversation on such a heavy note, but we just continue to peel back layers. And your book, Their Own Best Creations, is an important layer to that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Super readable. It's not the sort of thing that you're going to take to the beach. And it's a heavy lift.
It is from the University of California Press. That gives you a sense of sort of who I wrote this book for, but I would say that it is highly assignable to an undergraduate population or to your female relative who has maybe read some of the popular histories and is looking for something even more detailed with even additional sort of context, historical, and some extra discoveries. There are lots of really great books about women in TV, but a lot of them look at sort of the change from the 50s to the present. They're very big. They take a really wide lens, and that's excellent. It's not what I'm doing. So if you want to dive deep, then you should look at my book, Their Own Best Creations, Women Writers in Postwar Television. How's that for a soundbite?
That was a plug to beat all. I think Annie doesn't give herself enough credit. This is an important foundational look at this piece of history, and she provides all the receipts. She has reviewed the scripts. She's done all of the pieces so that it's kind of irrefutable. Right now, we are living in a world where people like to dispute facts. There are two sets of facts. No, there's not. There's one set of facts, and Annie has presented them. So in as much as I think there will be an opportunity for some other creative person out there to use your work as a springboard to further tell these stories and bring them even more into the modern mindset for us as women to understand what our mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers went through, it needed to be written, and you did a great job.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I really appreciate that.
What can women learn from reading this kind of history?
Well, in my conclusion, I write about how the kinds of tactics and strategies that women used in the 1950s to sort of ingratiate themselves with an American public and to do that in front of a dubious television industry really hasn't changed very much. I don't know if that's teaching you something, but just to be aware that maybe this narrative of progress, that things are better than they were before, is something that maybe cultivates a kind of unnecessary sense of gratitude from women working in whatever industry. To think about things are better than they were before, so I don't need to complain, I would advise them to look at an earlier period and ask, is it really better or is it just different? Or have institutions found ways to inculcate the sort of gratitude that's not necessary, and that women and men should fight for their rights within their chosen fields in the arts and elsewhere, because that is really the only way that change gets made.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, I have pictures of the writers and actors strike in my mind as I'm thinking about that.
Mm-hmm.
To your point that it's important to be tenacious, but I want to say that the other piece of it is to recognize where the individual needs to make sacrifice and work hard, and where it's the opportunity and the responsibility of the employer or the institution to make space and change.
Yes, indeed. Talk a little bit about the projects that are on your desk, if you're able to talk about it, all the other things you do in your free time.
Yeah.
And this book was put to bed during COVID?
Yes, that's right. It went into production and it came out in January 2022.
What else are you working on?
I'm a freelance writer. So by the time that this podcast comes out, I'm not sure what will be most recent. Right now, I'm working on some pieces for the Washington Post about books and the Washington City paper. I'm writing an essay on the anniversary of the film The Notebook for Literary Hub. So you should look for that later this summer/early fall. If you're interested in women in film, I wrote a piece this spring for The Village Voice about Nicole Holofcener. And if you want to talk more about the way that the industry treats writers, I wrote a piece this year on Marvel Hates Actors for Film Quarterly that I have had an opportunity to re-up due to recent events and the news. And last, sort of for maybe the more academically inclined listener, last year I contributed to a 2-volume set of journal issues for the Feminist Media Histories journal. It's 2 volumes called Speculative Approaches to Media History. And speculative approaches, meaning what do you do when you don't have enough archival evidence? How do you fill that in, or how do you contextualize? How do you study an incomplete object? I also just did a podcast interview for the New Books Network about a book called Incomplete, The Feminist Possibilities of the Unfinished Film. So speculative approaches are growing. I start to go there a little bit in their own best creations because there is this incomplete television historical record. But in my article for this journal, I wrote a ficto-critical, part fiction, part critical portrait of Paula Strasberg, who is the wife of Lee Strasberg, who is the director of the Actors Studio. So if you're interested in archival absence and post-war wife and motherhood, and you feel like you would read that as a novel or as an academic article, and you're willing to read half of that, or if both are interesting and you want to read the whole thing, you should check out Feminist Media Histories from last summer.
Awesome.
It sounds like a long time ago, but as we know, academic publications are a little bit slower to come out. So I'm playing it from a year ago, but I feel like it's like in dog years. You should pretend it was like from 3 months ago.
You clearly love your work.
I do. I really do. And I love talking to people who, like you, who are equally passionate on these subjects.
So how do people get a hold of you to tell you how great your work is?
Oh, wow. Just go to annieberke.com And there's multiple ways to contact me.
And included at your website are your social media handles. And
yes, which is at Say Anything, a pun on Say Anything, the John Cusack movie. At Say Anything is both Twitter, Instagram, and now I'm on Blue Sky. Ugh. I'm like, oh, I'm so reachable by social media. And yet, what is it all for?
I haven't made the jump away from Twitter yet. I'm just going to sit there for a while.
I'm going to go down with the ship, it seems, but I don't want to speak too soon. By the time this podcast comes out, who knows? Who knows what will be happening with Twitter or X and with my relationship to it. But right now I'm on all of them.
You know, I'll just say this, listeners, you may track me through Twitter, and I feel like I have 1,900 people who kind of get a feel for who I am. I know who they are. And it spans academia and entertainment interested people and gender studies and media studies and authors and some performers and writers and things. I cannot replicate that community. And
No.
They would just take a long time. So as much as I am sad and frustrated and everything by the politics that have taken over that particular platform, I'm not going to do something that actually damages my current situation.
I know. I'm in the same boat. This is how I find out about great work and how I share my own.
Did you do a reference in your book to Tina Fey and the Carrie Fisher episode?
Of course, yes. Very important to me.
Annie, I'd really like for you to share that Tina Fey, Carrie Fisher bit that you put in your book, and that'll perhaps provide your concluding context. And then I have a Betty White one to share. Go ahead.
Okay. Do you want me to explain it or did you want me to read it?
Either one.
Well, let me open it. In the Rosemary's Baby episode of 30 Rock, contemporary comedy writer Liz Lemon, played by Tina Fey, meets Rosemary Howard, played by Carrie Fisher, a television writer from the 70s and Liz's childhood idol. Liz is initially starstruck by the gutsy, smart-talking broad, a woman who encourages her to take risks as the head writer of NBC's comedy variety show TGS. We pushed the envelope, Rosemary crows, recalling an edgier comedy past before network comedies took their orders from corporate parent companies like NBC's General Electric. You're not a cog in their machine. But Liz soon discovers that Rosemary is a rotten role model, a lonely, unstable alcoholic who lives in an imagined glory age of television. When Liz cuts ties, Rosemary lashes out, accusing her of being like her, married to your job, before settling into the role of embittered mother, yelling, I broke down barriers for you. You're my kid who never calls. Liz returns to the television studio, back to her job and to what her boss, Jack Donaghy, calls working inside the system. In assembling a history of television's past, there is the impulse to fast forward to the present. What use do we have now for an account of women television writers way back when? So that's where I'll stop. That episode is it sort of does a bunch of the kind of work that I'm doing in the book.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of thinking about what we do with these past histories, recognizing the kind of faultiness and incompletion we get even from the most compelling and interesting oral histories. Like, how do we remember our own time? There's certainly, I see lots of contradictions. Some women saying, like, you couldn't get a job at NBC in writing, and other women saying, I got a job at NBC in writing. And you're like, okay, I think CBS is the one where I started to see those because it was so, working in an industry that can be very subjective, uneven, and opaque, frankly. But it's still worth looking into not just what was going on, but how we remember what happened, because it does determine the way that things are run now in the writer's room, in the studio, and sort of in developing those relationships between the talent and the fans.
It is very relevant today, what you've just said. It ties back to maybe something that was sitting in Tina Fey's mind. Maybe someday you'll get a chance to ask her. What was the genesis of that episode?
I don't know. I'm kind of scared of her. She seems like, honestly, she seems like the type that doesn't suffer fools. And like, I don't know from day to day if I'm going to be sharp or a fool. So I like to be with people who are not scary. But obviously, I'm very impressed by the work she does. And I draw on it a ton because she's so reflective about feminism and the media making apparatus. Props to Tina Fey.
Well, I think you've given that episode a lot of thought. To question the genesis may find a scenario or a reflection that is closer to your own. I'll close on this two little notes, and that is, number one, every single time we read about the work and the endurance and the diligence of all of these women, even though it was a different time and they drove different cars and they had to wear high heels, God bless them. And our life is different in so many ways, and we have it in some ways easier and in some ways harder. But the challenge is still there. And so you have to call upon kind of your inner strength and appreciate your own confidence and be your own cheerleader, but then also recognize the women around you need your assistance too. We can never forget our women colleagues who are trying to do their best as well. They need some support at the most important time. And then the breakthrough happens. And that's how change evolves. That's how things get better. It's not just one person feeling like they're beating their head against the wall. All that happens is a bloody head.
Hear, hear.
And when I think about this, and the thing that makes me smile is, and I'm sure you watched it, the episode of Life with Elizabeth starring Betty White. I have an 8-episode DVD of the best of Life with Elizabeth. And so I'm watching them and I'm just like, Betty, what are you trying to say to me? What was your influence in this show? And she was still alive when I did the podcast episode on Betty White. And I'm just fascinated because these were preserved, and she's sarcastic and she's saucy. And at the very end of something where you knew that the male writer required the last bit to sort of be misogynistic or in some way denigrate Betty, she kind of turns around, looks into the camera, and winks. I swear, I just saw Sue Ann Nivens, and that was 22 years or something before Sue Ann graced WJM. Anyway, we owe it to Betty White and Tina Fey and the Annie Burkes of the world to continue doing our best work and read more into the things that we watch and read, recognizing that we all have stories to tell, and we are all the ones capable of telling and sharing those stories and supporting the other women who do.
Oh, thank you so much.
You are welcome. Thank you to Mary Lou Morose for putting the finishing touches on this interview. Lots of ums and ahs and restarts. We appreciate Mary Lou for all she does. Our audio is provided by Jazzer. It's called Take Me Higher, found at Free Music Archive. Listen to Advanced TV Herstory on almost anywhere you find podcasts, but not everywhere, but specifically YouTube and Spotify and most podcatchers. Subscribe to our e-newsletter, our newsletter, which only comes out monthly. Your information won't be shared. Go to tvherstory.com and sign up, please. It's the way that you will find out stuff that I don't share on social media because, as we talked about, there's just too much stuff happening on social media, and it's a time suck, and I'd rather spend my time working on things that I can bring to you in this podcast and in other written forms. You are why I podcast, gang. You really are. This is why I've been doing this for 8 years. It's you. I'm your host, Cynthia Themis Abrams.